Imagine your empire crumbling before your eyes in mere seconds. Everything you sacrificed, sleepless nights, relationships, and your very soul for, gone. The fortune you built with blood and sweat, the multi-million-dollar contracts, the market, respect, all stolen in the blink of an eye. And the worst is yet to come. When you look into the eyes of betrayal, discovering that the person who knows every secret of yours, who you embraced as family, who you trusted your entire life, was the one who orchestrated your complete ruin. How would you uncover the truth when everyone thinks you're bankrupt and destroyed? How would you infiltrate the heart of the conspiracy when enemies control everything you built? The answer? Disappear. Completely. Become invisible. Transform into the last person anyone would suspect. Disguised millionaire works as farmhand to discover who stole his fortune. A story of betrayal, revenge, and redemption that will forever change how you see power, wealth, and true loyalty. Before we begin this thrilling story, drop a comment telling us which city you're watching from. It'll be my pleasure to give your comment a little heart. Now let's dive into this exciting story. The Manhattan skyline glittered outside the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Harrison Agricultural Industries penthouse office. James Harrison stood motionless, staring at the document in his hand, while the world he had built for 20 years crumbled around him. "This can't be right," he muttered, his voice barely audible in the cavernous office. "There has to be some mistake." But there was no mistake. The reports were clear. $2.3 billion missing. International accounts emptied. Assets transferred. Shell. Companies created and dissolved within weeks. A devastatingly elegant financial heist that had been happening right under his nose for months. James ran his hand through his salt and pepper hair, his piercing blue eyes scanning the numbers again. The broad-shouldered man who had built an agricultural empire from nothing was now left with virtually nothing. His hands, soft from years of boardroom meetings instead of fieldwork, trembled slightly as he set down the paper. "Mr. Harrison?" His assistant Catherine poked her head in. "The board members are waiting in the conference room. Tell them I need 10 more minutes, he replied, his voice steady despite the hurricane raging inside him. The moment the door closed, James slammed his fist onto the mahogany desk. The pain shot through his arm, but it was nothing compared to the betrayal burning in his chest. He turned to the wall of financial diagrams and corporate structure charts. Every subsection of Harrison Agricultural Industries that he had meticulously built, gone. The only remnants were the flagship model farm in rural Pennsylvania and a few smaller holdings that were, inexplicably, left untouched. James pulled up the security footage from the financial department. Countless faces, employees he trusted, people he'd hired, executives he'd mentored. One of them, or perhaps several, had orchestrated his downfall. His phone buzzed. A text from his sister, Victoria. "Tell me it isn't true. CNN is reporting HAI is facing bankruptcy." Before he could reply, another message from his CFO, Michael Randall. "James, we need to talk immediately. Things are worse than we thought." Then, a notification from his bank. "Unusual activity detected on your personal accounts." James quickly checked his personal banking app. His stomach dropped. The personal fortune he had kept separate from the company, another $50 million, was gone. Every account drained to zero. He stumbled backward into his chair. This wasn't just corporate sabotage. This was personal, calculated, intimate. The intercom buzzed again. "Mr. Harrison, the board is getting restless." James stared at the documents, spread across his desk. Financial analysis, transfer records, account statements. His eyes caught a pattern in the routing numbers, a sequence he recognized. All the transfers had been approved through a unique authentication system that only 3 people in the company had access to. "Catherine," he called through the intercom, "bring me the access logs for the financial authentication system. The entire year." 5 minutes later, James stared at the log. Every fraudulent transfer had been authenticated during times he was publicly visible elsewhere. Board meetings, international conferences, charity galas. Someone had been operating with precision, knowing his schedule, his methods, his security protocols. James flipped open his personal safe behind the painting of his parents' original farm, the one that had started it all. Inside lay a black, leather notebook where he kept his most private thoughts and business ideas. He flipped through it, stopping at pages where he'd jotted down potential security weaknesses in the company, ideas for restructuring, even personal fears about certain Executives. Several pages had been torn out. His blood ran cold. No hacker could have accessed this. No external thief would know about this notebook. The betrayal came from someone close, someone he trusted implicitly. James looked up at the panoramic view of New York City. For 20 years, he had been the untouchable agricultural king, transforming a modest family farm into a global powerhouse. His competitors feared him. Farmers respected him. Politicians courted him. Now, in a matter of hours, it was all gone. The intercom buzzed a third time. "Sir, the board is demanding you come immediately. The lawyers have arrived as well." James took a deep breath and straightened his custom Italian suit. He would face them, but he already knew what would happen. The board would remove him. The lawyers would begin bankruptcy proceedings. The media would feast on his downfall for weeks. But as James walked toward the conference room, a dangerous idea formed in his mind. If the thief knew his every move, his every thought, his every security protocol, then he needed to become someone the thief could never anticipate. "Catherine," he said, stopping at her desk, "cancel my schedule for tomorrow, and get me the employee records for the model farm in Pennsylvania." "The model farm?" Catherine looked confused. "But sir, with everything happening—" "Just do it," he said quietly. "And Catherine, don't tell anyone." James entered the conference room where 12 board members sat in silence, their faces grim. Financial reports and emergency press releases lay scattered across the table. "Gentlemen, ladies," James said calmly, taking his seat at the head of the table, "I believe we have much to discuss." 3 hours later, James Harrison was no longer CEO of Harrison Agricultural Industries. By unanimous vote, he had been removed from all operational control. Back in his office, James packed a small box of personal items. He looked around at the empire he had built and lost in a day. As the city lights began to twinkle in the dusk, a fire ignited in his chest. Whoever had taken everything from him had made one critical mistake. They had left him with nothing to lose. James picked up the employee records for the model farm. His eyes settled on a notice for seasonal workers needed for the spring planting. A plan began to form, one so audacious, so beneath the dignity of James Harrison, billionaire, that no one would ever see it coming. "As you look at the documents proving your crumbling empire," he whispered to himself, "a certainty grows in your chest. Whoever stole your fortune knew every detail of your business. Could it be possible that the person you trusted most in the world was responsible for your ruin?" James Harrison's jaw set with determination. He would find out, and when he did, his revenge would be as methodical and devastating as the betrayal itself. The billionaire closed his office door for the last time, but instead of heading to his penthouse apartment, he took the elevator down to the street level. Tomorrow, James Harrison would begin to disappear, and someone new would emerge from his ashes. James Harrison stood in the modest hotel room he'd paid for in cash, staring at his reflection in the bathroom mirror. His designer suit was gone, replaced by a plain white t-shirt that revealed arms stronger than most would expect from a corporate executive, a remnant of his childhood on his parents' farm. But they weren't the arms of a man who'd spent the last 2 decades performing manual labor. "This will never work," he muttered, running his fingers through his perfectly styled hair. "They'll spot me instantly." On the bed lay a small duffel bag containing his new identity: worn jeans, flannel shirts, work boots, and a weathered baseball cap. Next to it sat a disposable phone, a few $100s in cash, and a counterfeit driver's license for James Hayes, a man who had never run a billion-dollar company, never sipped champagne on a private jet, never addressed shareholders. James picked up the scissors he'd purchased at a drugstore. His hand hesitated for a moment before he brought them to his hair. Snip. The first lock of his $300 haircut fell to the floor. Snip. Snip. More followed. There was something liberating about destroying the perfect appearance he'd maintained for so long. When he was done, he barely recognized himself. His carefully styled hair was now a rough, uneven cut that he'd have to get fixed at a cheap barbershop later, something James Harrison would never be caught dead doing. His phone vibrated on the nightstand, his personal number that only a handful of people had. "I heard what happened," the voice said when he answered. "I'm so sorry, James." It was David Chen, his oldest friend and personal attorney, the one person James had contacted after leaving his office for the last time. "Are you sure about this plan?" David asked. "We could go to the FBI, let them handle the investigation." James stared at his newly shorn hair in the mirror. "No, whoever did this has connections. They'd know immediately, And they still have access to my accounts, my records. They might even have people inside the FBI. This is insane, James, David insisted. You, living as a farmhand? You haven't done manual labor since you were 18, which is exactly why no one will look for me. There, James replied. David, this person knew me. They knew my schedule, my habits, my security protocols. They even knew about my personal notebook. This wasn't some random hacker. This was someone close. There was silence on the other end of the line. Your family? David finally asked, his voice lowered. James closed his eyes. The question had been haunting him since he'd discovered the theft. His sister Victoria, who had always resented his control of the company after their parents died. His cousin Michael, the CFO who'd helped build the empire. His ex-wife Eleanor, who'd walked away with a surprisingly modest settlement 5 years earlier. I don't know, James admitted, but I'm going to find out. And your plan is to work as a laborer on your own model farm? The one that's now controlled by the board? The farm manager there, Peterson, has been with me since the beginning. He doesn't know who bought the company in the bankruptcy proceedings, and seasonal workers come and go. No one will look twice at another desperate man needing work. David sighed. What do you need from me? Keep an eye on the bankruptcy proceedings. Find out who's buying up the company assets. And most importantly, don't tell anyone I've contacted you. Be careful, James, David said. These people took everything from you. What's to stop them from killing me? James finished the sentence. Because I'm not a threat to them anymore. James Harrison is finished. Destroyed. They won. Unless you find out who they are. James looked at his reflection again. At the stranger staring back at him. Exactly. After he hung up, James took out the beard dye he'd purchased. 30 minutes later, his salt and pepper beard was transformed into a solid brown, making him look years younger. He rubbed his palms with sandpaper, creating rough patches that would help sell the illusion of someone used to manual labor. From another bag, he pulled out a bottle of sunscreen with a strong tint. He applied it to his face, neck, and hands, darkening his complexion to that of someone who'd spent years working outdoors. It wouldn't last forever, but it would help initially, until he developed a real tan. James practiced his new walk in front of the mirror, no longer the confident stride of a CEO, but the slightly hunched gait of a man beaten down by life, someone who didn't want to be noticed. Name's James Hayes, he practiced, deliberately roughening his voice and adding a slight rural accent. Looking for work, heard you was hiring. James grimaced, his perfect diction, refined at Princeton and polished. In boardrooms was difficult to disguise. He'd have to work on that. The next morning, James checked out of the hotel and bought a used pickup truck from a dealership on the outskirts of town, paying cash. The salesman barely looked at his fake ID. The truck was at least 15 years old, with rust spots and squeaky brakes, but it ran well enough. Perfect for farm work, the salesman had said with a wink, probably assuming James was an illegal immigrant looking for agricultural jobs. As James drove toward rural Pennsylvania, he thought about the farm he was heading to. Ironically, Harrison Model Farm had been his pride and joy, a showcase of modern agricultural techniques combined with sustainable practices. He'd visited quarterly for inspections, always arriving by helicopter on the private landing pad, always surrounded by executives and assistants. The farmhands would be lined up like soldiers awaiting inspection. Now he'd be one of those farmhands, invisible, anonymous. 3 hours later, James pulled into a small town near the farm. He found the cheapest motel, a place the real James Harrison wouldn't have let his driver park near, and paid for a week in advance. In the grimy bathroom, he studied his reflection. The transformation was startling. His designer clothes were gone, replaced by faded jeans and a worn flannel shirt. His perfectly trimmed hair was now disheveled, his smooth face darkened by the tinted sunscreen and a 2-day beard. His manicured hands were deliberately roughened and stained with dirt. The physical transformation wasn't just cosmetic. James had always maintained his fitness, but now he would need to build different muscles, not the carefully sculpted physique from his private gym, but the functional strength required for hauling, digging, and lifting. His soft hands would need to develop calluses. His fair skin would need to tan and weather. But the most important transformation would be mental. James Harrison had been accustomed to commanding rooms, to having his every need anticipated and met. James Hayes would need to be invisible, subservient, careful. That night, lying on the lumpy motel mattress, James reviewed what he knew. The theft of his fortune had been meticulously planned, executed with intimate knowledge of his company, his security, and his personal habits. The model farm had been spared in the bankruptcy proceedings, suggesting it might hold some importance to whoever had engineered his downfall. His plan was simple: get hired as a seasonal worker, observe everything, identify who was really in, control now, and gradually work his way closer to the farm's administrative operations where records might be kept. James closed his eyes, remembering how he'd built his empire, starting with the small family farm his parents had left him, expanding methodically, acquiring competitors, modernizing operations. 20 years of his life, gone in an instant. A cold determination settled over him. He would rebuild. But first, he would find the traitor. The next morning, James Hayes drove his beat-up truck to the gates of Harrison Model Farm. The familiar sign had already been changed. Now it read, Heartland Agricultural Center. He joined a small group of men waiting outside the administrative building, all clearly there for the same reason: the seasonal hiring. A burly foreman emerged from the building, clipboard in hand. All right, listen up. We need 20 men for the spring planting. Work starts at 5 a.m., ends when the job's done. Pay is $15 an hour. If you can't handle the work, don't waste my time. James stood silently, keeping his head down, just another desperate man looking for work. He'd never seen this foreman before, another change since the takeover. You, the foreman pointed at James. Got any experience? James looked up, remembering to hunch his shoulders slightly. Grew up on a farm in Ohio, he said, his voice rougher than his natural tone. Worked fields most of my life. The foreman looked him up and down skeptically. Your hands don't look it. James had anticipated this. Been sick, he said. Hospital. For 3 months. Lost my job, my place. Need to start over. The foreman grunted, making a note on his clipboard. We'll see how long you last. Report to the South Field tomorrow, 5 a.m. sharp. As the foreman moved on to the next man, James caught sight of a familiar face emerging from the main building. Peterson, the farm manager who had worked for him for 15 years. James quickly turned away, pulling his cap lower. Peterson had seen James Harrison many times, though always in a suit, always surrounded by an entourage. Would he recognize his former boss in this disguise? Peterson walked past the group of laborers without a second glance, heading to a sleek black SUV waiting in the parking lot. James watched carefully as Peterson opened the rear door, and someone handed him a folder from inside the vehicle. James couldn't see who it was, but the brief interaction told him something important. Peterson was reporting to someone new. That night, back at the motel, James practiced his new persona again. He would need to be careful with Peterson. The farm manager was smart, observant, and had spent enough time around James to potentially recognize him despite the disguise. But Peterson might also be the key to discovering who was behind the theft. James laid out his work clothes for the next morning, his first day of manual labor in more than 20 years. For a moment, doubt crept in. His soft hands would blister within hours. His body would ache in ways he'd forgotten were possible. The former CEO of a multinational corporation would be taking orders from men he once employed. With hands still soft and without calluses, he whispered to himself, recalling the narrative he'd constructed. James knew his disguise would be tested on the first day of work. What he didn't imagine was that his biggest challenge wouldn't be hiding who he was, but discovering who the people around him really were. James set his alarm for 4 a.m. Tomorrow, James Hayes would begin his new life, and James Harrison would begin his hunt for the traitor who had destroyed everything he'd built. The sky was still dark when James's alarm blared at 4 a.m. For a moment, disoriented in the unfamiliar motel room, he reached for his phone as he would in his Manhattan penthouse. Reality crashed back as his hand touched the cheap plastic alarm clock instead. Day 1, he mumbled, wincing as his feet hit the cold linoleum floor. He dressed quickly in the work clothes he'd laid out the night before: faded jeans, a thermal undershirt, flannel, and the steel-toed boots that were still stiff and uncomfortable. In the bathroom mirror, a stranger looked back at him. James Hayes, not James Harrison, agricultural tycoon. The pre-dawn air bit through his clothes as he climbed into the old pickup truck. The heater rattled but provided little warmth. James drove through the sleeping town toward the farm he had once owned, following roads he had previously only flown over in his private helicopter. Harrison Model Farm, now Heartland Agricultural Center, sprawled across 2,000 acres of prime Pennsylvania farmland. In the dim pre-dawn light, James could make out the silhouettes of the massive grain silos he had commissioned, the state-of-the-art irrigation systems he had personally designed with engineers, and the award-winning sustainable barn complex that had been featured in agricultural magazines worldwide. A line of trucks and beat-up cars was already forming at the workers' entrance. James parked at the end of the line and joined a group of men huddled against the cold, stamping their feet and blowing into cupped hands. No one spoke. No one made eye contact. These were men who lived on the margins, grateful for seasonal work, invisible to the world James had previously inhabited. The gates opened at 4:45 a.m., and the foreman James had met yesterday, clipboard in hand, directed the workers to various locations. When James's turn came, the foreman, whose name badge read Mitch, looked him up and down skeptically. Hayes, right? Report to Rodriguez at the South Field. Row assignment duty. James nodded, careful to maintain his hunched posture and avoiding eye contact. And Hayes? Mitch added. Try not to quit before lunch. I got a bet going with Rodriguez. A few of the other workers chuckled. James felt his face flush with anger but kept his expression neutral. The James Harrison who could fire a man with a glance was gone. James Hayes had to swallow the insult. He followed a group of workers toward the South Field, a massive expanse that stretched for half a mile. The last time James had seen this field, he had been in the observation tower with investors, explaining how his proprietary crop rotation system had increased yields by 32% while reducing chemical usage. Now he would be working it with his hands. Short, muscular man with a weathered face was assigning tasks at the edge of the field. When James approached, Rodriguez barely looked at him. New guy, huh? Take plot 27, third row. Keep pace with Ernesto next to you. Fall behind, you're out. James looked where Rodriguez pointed. A lanky man about his age was already working, methodically, preparing the soil with a hand tool James vaguely remembered was called a cultivator. Nearby, a truck had dropped off stacks of seedling trays. What exactly am I? James began, but Rodriguez cut him off. Jesus, city boy. You prep the row, you plant the seedlings, you move to the next row. Ernesto will show you. Now move! James walked to plot 27, where Ernesto glanced up briefly. First day? Ernesto asked in accented English, his tone not unkind. Yeah, James replied, trying to sound casual. Been a while since I worked a field. Ernesto handed him a cultivator. Follow what I do. Not too deep, not too shallow. James took the tool and watched Ernesto's technique for a moment before attempting to mimic it. The first stroke sent shockwaves of pain up his arms. The cultivator was heavier than it looked, and the soil was densely packed. James gritted his teeth and continued, determined not to show weakness. Within 20 minutes, his hands were developing blisters. By 30 minutes, his back was screaming in protest. Ernesto was already halfway down his row while James had barely completed a quarter of his. Slow down. Use your legs more, Ernesto advised quietly. Save your back. Long day ahead. James nodded gratefully and adjusted his stance. The work was still punishing, but slightly more manageable. As the sun began to rise, casting long shadows across the field, James observed the operation around him. The farm was running differently than when he owned it. Under his direction, this field would have been worked with precision equipment. Soil sensors monitoring nutrient levels in real time, drones tracking growth patterns. Now it seemed the new owners had reverted to more traditional and labor-intensive methods. Why? The model farm had been a showcase of agricultural innovation. These methods were inefficient and expensive in the long run. Unless, who owns this place now? James asked Ernesto casually. The older man shrugged without pausing his work. Some investment company. Changed everything when they took over. Fired half the staff. Brought in these new managers. The old owner went bankrupt, right? James pressed, careful to keep his tone merely curious. That's what they say, Ernesto replied. Rich guy who flew in on a helicopter. Never saw him up, close. Heard he was a real bastard, though. Cared more about fancy technology than people. James nearly dropped his cultivator. Was that how his workers had seen him? A distant figure who cared more about profit margins than the people who made those profits possible? You worked here before? James asked, swallowing his discomfort. 5 years, Ernesto nodded. Was better before, even with the helicopter bastard. At least the old manager Peterson treated us fair. Now Peterson jumps whenever the new bosses call. And these new foremen, he gestured toward Rodriguez with his chin. They treat us like dogs. James fell silent, focusing on his work while digesting this information. Peterson was still here, but clearly reporting to new leadership. And the farm was being deliberately demodernized. Why? By mid-morning, James's hands were bleeding despite the work gloves he'd purchased. His muscles trembled with exhaustion. The sun beat down mercilessly, and his clothes were soaked with sweat. Around him, the other workers maintained a steady pace, their bodies conditioned by years of physical labor. At noon, a bell rang from the main building, and the workers put down their tools. Lunch break. James followed the others to a shaded area, where most men sat alone with packed lunches, or purchased food from a truck that had arrived. James bought a sandwich and a bottle of water, spending nearly an hour's wages. He found a spot slightly apart from the others, and sank down gratefully, his legs nearly giving out. Every muscle in his body screamed in protest. The sandwich, some unidentifiable meat with wilted lettuce, was possibly the worst thing he'd ever eaten, but he devoured it ravenously. "Hey, city boy." It was Rodriguez approaching with Mitch. "You made it to lunch. Looks like I owe Mitch $20. The men laughed, and James forced a smile. "Just getting warmed up," he said, the lie transparent to everyone. "We'll see." Rodriguez smirked. Afternoon's always hotter. As the foreman walked away, James noticed a sleek black car pulling up to the main administrative building. He recognized it immediately, the same SUV he had seen yesterday. The rear window was tinted, but the front was clear enough to see the driver. A woman with dark hair pulled back severely. Peterson emerged from the building and approached the vehicle. The rear door opened, and a man stepped out, tall, expensively, dressed, with the confident bearing of someone used to giving orders. James couldn't see his face clearly from this distance, but something about him seemed familiar. The man handed Peterson a folder, gesturing emphatically as he spoke. Peterson nodded repeatedly, his body language deferential, almost fearful. The conversation lasted less than 2 minutes before the man returned to the SUV. As the vehicle drove away, Peterson stood watching, his shoulders slumped. "Who was that?" James asked Ernesto, who had sat down nearby. Ernesto glanced toward the admin building. "One of the new owners, I think. Comes every few weeks. Always talking with Peterson." James committed the car's license plate to memory. It might be nothing, but it was the first tangible lead he had. The afternoon was even more brutal than the morning. The temperature rose, and the physical demands seemed to increase exponentially. By 3 o'clock, James's vision was beginning to blur, and his movements had become clumsy with fatigue. He had fallen far behind Ernesto despite the older man's occasional suggestions for more efficient techniques. "Hayes!" Rodriguez barked. "Pick up the pace or pack up!" James gritted his teeth and forced his battered body to move faster. He had survived boardroom battles, hostile takeovers, and financial crises. He would not be defeated by physical labor on the first day. At 5:30 p.m., after nearly 12 hours of continuous work, the end-of-day bell finally rang. James's row was only 3/4 complete, while most workers had finished multiple rows. He stood unsteadily, his muscles trembling, his hands raw despite the gloves. As the workers headed toward the parking area, James noticed Peterson walking toward the field. He quickly turned away, adjusting his cap to shadow his face, but Peterson wasn't looking at the workers. He was inspecting the field, making notes on a tablet. James reached his truck and collapsed into the driver's seat, barely able to grip the steering wheel with his ravaged hands. The drive back to the motel was a blur of pain and exhaustion. He barely made it to his room before his legs gave out. In the grimy bathroom, James surveyed the damage. His hands were a mess of blisters and raw skin. His face was sunburned despite the cap. Every muscle in his body felt torn. This wasn't the comfortable soreness from his private gym in Manhattan. This was a deep, brutal pain that spoke of body systems pushed well beyond their limits. He stood under the lukewarm shower for nearly 30 minutes, letting the water soothe his battered body. As physically devastating as the day had been, his mind was sharply focused on what he had observed. The farm was being deliberately run below its technological capacity. Peterson was clearly taking orders from new ownership, and whoever was in that SUV might be connected to the theft of his fortune. After the shower, James forced himself to record his observations in a small notebook, then treated his hands with antiseptic and bandages from a first aid kit he'd purchased. He set his alarm for 4 a.m. again, knowing tomorrow would be even harder as the soreness set in. As he lay on the lumpy mattress, staring at the water stains on the ceiling, James reflected on Ernesto's words. Heard he was a real bastard, though. cared, more about fancy technology than people. For 20 years, James Harrison had prided himself on being a visionary businessman, transforming agriculture through technology and innovation. But had he lost sight of the human cost? Had he become so focused on efficiency and profit that he'd forgotten the actual people who made his empire possible? The irony wasn't lost on him. Now he was experiencing firsthand what his workers had endured for years: the exhaustion, the physical toll, the casual disrespect from management. As he observed the exhausted workers at the end of the day, I whispered to himself, recalling the narrative he'd constructed. James felt something strange: guilt. These people had worked like this for years on his land, while he enjoyed luxury. But a figure was watching James suspiciously from the top of the farm headquarters. Was it possible that someone already suspected his true identity? James closed his eyes, but sleep wouldn't come easily. His body was beyond exhausted, but his mind raced with new questions, new suspicions, and a growing awareness that finding the thief might be only part of his journey. From the window of the main building, a silhouette had indeed been watching. The new worker who called himself James Hayes. Something about the man seemed oddly familiar, despite the rough clothes and weathered appearance. Perhaps it was nothing, but in this game of high stakes, nothing could be left to chance. A phone call was made and instructions were given. Watch the new farmhand closely, very closely. The second day was worse than the first. James awoke to muscles so stiff he could barely move. His alarm blared at 4 a.m., but it took him nearly 15 minutes to swing his legs over the side of the bed. His hands, despite the bandages he'd applied the night before, were raw and throbbing. The simple act of buttoning his shirt sent waves of pain through his fingers. This was a mistake, he whispered to his reflection in the bathroom mirror. The face that stared back was almost unrecognizable, sunburned, haggard, with dark circles, under bloodshot eyes. But quitting wasn't an option. Somewhere on that farm was the key to finding who had stolen his fortune, and after just one day of physical labor, James had gained insights into his former company that 20 years of executive reports had never provided. The drive to the farm was torture. Every bump in the road sent jolts of pain through his abused body. In the pre-dawn darkness, James noticed several workers carpooling in a battered van, something he'd missed yesterday. He made a mental note to look for potential rideshare opportunities. His cash reserves wouldn't last forever. At the farm entrance, Mitch seemed surprised to see him. "Well, look who made it today too," he announced loudly to the other workers. "Hayes is tougher than he looks." A few workers glanced at James with something approaching respect. Surviving the first day had apparently earned him a small measure of credibility. Rodriguez assigned him to the same row he hadn't finished yesterday. "Complete your row, then join Ernesto on field B. Try not to bleed all over my crops." The joke got a few chuckles from nearby workers. James forced a smile and headed to his row, where Ernesto was already working. "You came back," Ernesto observed, genuine surprise in his voice. "Didn't have anything better to do," James replied, wincing as he gripped the cultivator. Ernesto noticed his bandaged hands. "Wait," he said, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a pair of well-worn leather work gloves. "Use these. Better than those new ones you bought." James hesitated, then accepted the gloves gratefully. They were broken in, supple but durable. "Thanks. I'll get them back to you. Keep them," Ernesto interrupted. "Got another pair. Been doing this 30 years. He paused, studying James. "You haven't." "What's your story, Hayes?" James had prepared for this question. "Had my own business in Ohio. Farm equipment sales. Economy tanked. Lost everything. Wife left. Figured I'd try the other side of the business." Ernesto nodded, seemingly satisfied. "Economy's always tanking for people like us, never for the bosses." He gestured toward the main building, like whoever owns this place now. Buys a bankrupt farm, cuts wages, pushes us harder. "Seems like they're going backward," James observed, carefully testing the waters. "All this manual labor instead of the automated systems." "Noticed that too?" Ernesto raised an eyebrow. "Peterson, the manager, he's as confused as anyone. Keeps getting orders to shut down the fancy systems. Makes no sense. This place was making money." This confirmed James's suspicions. The new owners weren't trying to maximize productivity. They had another agenda. As they worked, James noticed more workers arriving in the fields. Among them was a group being led by a young woman carrying a clipboard. They were dressed differently than the regular farmhands, more like students on a field trip. "Who are they?" James asked. Ernesto glanced over. Interns. College kids studying agriculture. The farm still has some program with the university. That's Sarah, the farm accountant. Nice lady. Too nice for this place. James watched as Sarah led the students through the field, pointing out various aspects of the operation. She was perhaps in her early 30s, professionally dressed, but not expensively so, with practical boots and a light jacket. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she spoke with animated gestures. "She's been here long?" James asked casually. "Couple months. Came with the new ownership." Ernesto shrugged. "Stays in her office mostly. Only person Peterson. Seems to trust. Interesting. A new accountant who arrived with the new owners." James filed that information away. By mid-morning, James's muscles had moved past initial stiffness into a state of numb compliance. The borrowed gloves made a significant difference, protecting his raw hands. His technique with the cultivator had improved slightly, though he was still far slower than the experienced workers. During the lunch break, instead of isolating himself as he had yesterday, James deliberately sat near a group of workers. He ate silently, listening to their conversations. Most talked about family, local sports, weekend plans, ordinary concerns of working men, but occasionally they'd mention changes at the farm since the new ownership. "Peterson's scared of something," one older worker said quietly. 20 years I've known him. Never seen him so jumpy. It's that suit who comes in the black car," another replied. "Peterson nearly pisses himself whenever that guy shows up. Heard they're selling off equipment," a third added. "Bobby in maintenance said they dismantled half the automated irrigation system last week. Shipped it out at night." James focused on his sandwich, careful not to show too much interest. The new owners were systematically stripping the farm of its advanced technology that represented millions in investment. Why? After lunch, as James headed back to his row, he noticed Sarah walking alone toward a small outbuilding near the edge of the property. It was an old storage barn that James remembered had been slated for demolition years ago. Something about her furtive manner caught his attention. "Need to use the restroom," James told Ernesto. "Back in a few minutes." He walked toward the main buildings as if heading to the workers' facilities, then cut between two equipment sheds, circling back. Toward the old barn, he approached cautiously, aware that his absence from the field would be noticed if he took too long. The barn door was ajar. James moved quietly to the side window, which was grimy but afforded a partial view inside. Sarah was there, using her phone's flashlight to examine what looked like old filing cabinets pushed against the back wall. She pulled open a drawer and began rifling through folders, occasionally taking pictures with her phone. After several minutes, she extracted a thick folder and tucked it under her arm. She glanced nervously toward the door, then continued searching. James ducked back as she approached the window, then watched as she emerged from the barn, looked around cautiously, and walked briskly back toward the main office building. That evening, after another grueling day, James forced his aching body to remain in his truck after the other workers had left. He parked far enough away to avoid attention, but maintained a clear view of the administrative building. As dusk fell, most of the office lights went out. Peterson left at 6:30, followed by the remaining office staff. Sarah was the last to leave at nearly 7 p.m. She walked to her car, a modest sedan, but instead of driving toward the main gate, she circled behind the building complex. James started his truck and followed at a distance, keeping his headlights off. Her car stopped near the old barn. In the dimming light, James watched as she entered the structure again, this time carrying what looked like a small laptop, making a split-second decision. James quietly exited his truck and moved closer, using the growing shadows for cover. He positioned himself outside the barn's rear window, which was partially broken. Sarah had set up her laptop on an old workbench and was connecting a portable hard drive. She opened the folder she had collected earlier, spreading documents across the surface. From his vantage point, James could hear her mumbling to herself as she worked. "This doesn't make sense," she said, comparing a document to something on her screen. "These transfers don't align with the official records." James strained to see what she was examining. The papers appeared to be financial records, balance sheets, and transfer authorizations. Some bore the Harrison Agricultural Industries logo. Sarah suddenly froze, then quickly gathered the documents. "Hello?" she called out. "Is someone there?" James remained motionless, barely breathing. After a tense moment, Sarah resumed her work, but with frequent glances toward the door. For nearly an hour, she worked methodically, photographing documents and making notes on her laptop. Finally, she packed everything away, carefully returning the folder to the filing cabinet and erased all signs of her presence. James retreated to his truck before she emerged and watched as she drove away. His mind raced with possibilities. Was Sarah investigating the same financial discrepancies that had led to his downfall? Or was she part of the scheme, removing evidence? The next morning, James arrived at the farm with a plan. His body still ached terribly, but the physical pain had become secondary to his growing determination. He had survived 2 days of grueling labor. He could survive more if it meant getting closer to the truth. When Rodriguez assigned him to field maintenance, clearing irrigation ditches, James noticed the location was near the old barn. Perfect. By mid-afternoon, James had worked his way to the section closest to the barn. Most workers were focused on the main fields, leaving him relatively unwatched. During a water break, he casually approached the barn as if seeking shade. The door was locked, but James remembered the broken rear window. He glanced around to ensure no one was watching, then quickly slipped inside. The interior was dim and dusty, filled with old equipment and forgotten supplies. The filing cabinets Sarah had examined were against the back wall, partially hidden behind stacked crates. James moved toward them, conscious that his absence would be noticed if he stayed too long. The first cabinet contained mundane operational records, maintenance logs, equipment manuals, employee schedules from years ago. The second cabinet was more promising. Its drawers held financial records dating back to the founding of Harrison Agricultural Industries. James quickly located the folder Sarah had been examining. Inside were records that shouldn't exist, shadow ledgers showing transactions that had never appeared in the official company books. Parallel financial statements showed money moving through a series of shell companies, eventually disappearing into offshore accounts. With trembling hands, James photographed several pages with his cheap phone. The records were incomplete, but they clearly documented the systematic draining of company assets over the past year. Small amounts at first, then increasingly larger sums as the scheme progressed. A noise outside made him freeze. Footsteps approached the barn door. James quickly returned the folder and slipped behind a stack of crates. The door opened, and light spilled into the dusty interior. "Hello? Anyone in here?" It was Mitch, the foreman. James held his breath, pressing himself against the wall. After what seemed like an eternity, the door closed, and the footsteps moved away. He waited several minutes before emerging from his hiding place. He needed to return to work immediately, or risk raising suspicions. But as he turned to leave, a different folder caught his eye. It had fallen partially out of the cabinet, revealing a company letterhead he recognized. James quickly opened it. Inside were documents detailing the sale of Harrison Agricultural Industries assets after the bankruptcy. Most had been purchased by a company called Heartland Agricultural Investments, the new owners of the model farm. But the incorporation papers for Heartland showed it was a subsidiary of another company, Vertex Capital Partners. The name was vaguely familiar to James. He photographed these documents as well, then carefully replaced the folder and slipped out through the broken window. For the rest of the day, James worked mechanically, his mind processing what he had discovered. The financial records proved that his company had been systematically looted from within, and whoever controlled Vertex Capital Partners had orchestrated the takeover of his assets after his fall. That evening, in his motel room, James examined the photos he'd taken. The image quality was poor, but the content was clear enough. The transaction records showed repeated transfers to accounts with routing numbers that looked oddly familiar. Then it hit him. He'd seen those numbers before, in his personal notebook, where he'd jotted down his sister Victoria's banking information years ago when he'd helped her set up her investment accounts. The name that appeared repeatedly in the records was unthinkable, James whispered to himself, the shock of realization settling like ice in his stomach. How could his own sister be involved in the scheme? He paced the small motel room, trying to process this betrayal. Victoria had always resented being passed over for leadership of the company after their parents died. She had the financial acumen to orchestrate something like this. But would she really destroy her own brother? James was so absorbed in his thoughts that he almost missed the sound of a car pulling into the motel parking lot. A familiar black SUV, the same one he'd seen at the farm, stopped directly in front of his room. The driver's door opened, and the severe-looking woman he'd glimpsed earlier stepped out, scanning the motel. James quickly turned off the lights and moved to the window, peering through a crack in the curtains. The rear door of the SUV opened, but whoever was inside remained there, speaking to the driver. After a brief conversation, the woman returned to the vehicle, which then circled the parking lot once before departing. They were looking for someone. Looking for him? James's heart raced. His cover might be compromised. He needed to be more careful, more invisible, but he also needed to continue his investigation. The old barn clearly contained more evidence, and Sarah the accountant was pursuing the same trail. As he lay in bed that night, his body screaming from the day's labor, James reviewed his options. He could confront Victoria directly, but without concrete proof, she would simply deny everything. He needed to find the connection between Victoria and Vertex Capital Partners. He needed to understand why the new owners were dismantling the farm's technology, and he needed to determine whether Sarah was an ally or another enemy. With his hands bleeding after the third consecutive day of work, James murmured to himself, staring at his raw palms in the dim motel light. James began to question everything he had built. That's when he found, hidden in the old barn, a ledger that shouldn't exist, with transactions that could explain the disappearance of his fortune. But the discovery had raised more questions than it had answered, and as the black SUV's appearance suggested, someone might already be suspicious of the new farmhand asking too many questions. Tomorrow would be even more dangerous. Tomorrow, James would need to get closer to Sarah, to Peterson, to the truth, while ensuring that his own identity remained hidden, because now he knew that his own family might be involved in his downfall, and family betrayal was the most dangerous kind of all. Outside the motel, parked across the street, the driver of the black SUV made a phone call. "Yes, we found where he's staying. The motel on Route 27. She paused, listening. "No, we didn't approach. Following your instructions to observe, only." Another pause. "Yes, I understand. We'll continue surveillance. If he makes one wrong move, we'll know." The call ended, and the SUV pulled away into the night. The hunter was now being hunted. Dawn broke with rain pounding against James's motel window. His fourth day undercover brought mixed blessings. His aching body would get partial relief from the downpour, but the weather complicated his investigation. "Perfect," he muttered, noting the black SUV parked across the street, partially hidden behind a delivery truck. They weren't even trying to be subtle anymore. At the farm, Rodriguez was assigning workers to indoor tasks. Haze, seed sorting, in the storage facility. Try not to mess that up too. The storage facility meant proximity to the administrative building, exactly where James needed to be. Inside, dozens of workers sorted seeds at long tables. James took his position immediately, spotting Sarah through a window in the adjacent office building. "First rain of planting season," remarked the worker beside him, an older man named Luis. "Always brings the suits around." "Suits?" James asked casually. "Big bosses, board members. They don't like getting their fancy shoes muddy, but they always show up when we're indoors." Luis lowered his voice. "Peterson's been in meetings all morning." By mid-morning, James had developed a rhythm, sorting seeds while watching the office. Through the windows, he observed Peterson pacing nervously before three well-dressed visitors. One was immediately recognizable, Michael Randall, James's former CFO and cousin. James's heart pounded. Michael had been one of his most trusted executives, family by blood. Could he be involved in the conspiracy? Taking a bathroom break, James told the supervisor, then slipped out. Instead of heading to the restroom, he circled behind the building, positioning himself near an open window where voices drifted out. "The equipment liquidation is proceeding ahead of schedule," Michael was saying. "Another $3 million from the irrigation system dismantling." "And Harrison?" A woman's voice. Familiar, but not Victoria's. "Still no trace," Michael replied. "Our sources say he's left the country. He's not that stupid," the woman responded. "James always has contingency plans. With all accounts frozen and assets seized, he's powerless," Michael assured her. "Besides, he doesn't know about the offshore structure." James's fists clenched. Michael was definitely involved. The woman remained a mystery, but her knowledge of James's habits suggested personal familiarity. A supervisor rounded the corner, forcing James to retreat. Back at the sorting table, his mind raced with implications. Michael's presence confirmed his suspicions about internal betrayal. But who was the woman? And where was Victoria in all this? During lunch, James noticed Sarah sitting alone in the cafeteria, reviewing documents while eating. Making a calculated risk, he approached with his tray. "Mind if I sit here? Other tables are full." Sarah looked up, surprised to see a field worker addressing her. After a moment's hesitation, she nodded, quickly covering her documents. "New here, right?" she asked. "Hayes, isn't it?" James was startled she knew his name. "That's right. Just started this week. I processed the payroll," she explained, noting his expression. "I know everyone's names eventually." They ate in awkward silence before James ventured. "Lot of management. Visits today." Sarah tensed slightly. "Just routine meetings." Didn't seem routine to Peterson. Man looked terrified. Sarah studied him with newfound interest. "You're observant for a field hand." "Observation keeps you employed," James replied, like noticing that the farm's being stripped while still operational. "Doesn't make business sense." "No," Sarah agreed cautiously. "It doesn't." Their conversation was interrupted by her phone ringing. She answered, listened briefly, then gathered her things. "Excuse me, I'm needed in accounting." As she hurried away, James noticed she'd left a small notebook under her napkin. Glancing around to ensure no one was watching, he slipped it into his pocket. That evening in his motel room, James examined Sarah's notebook. Most pages contained routine calculations, but a folded paper was tucked inside, a printout of a GI. Banking transaction showing $7 million transferred from Harrison, Agricultural Industries to a Cayman Islands account. The transaction was authorized by digital signature, James's signature, dated during his last international conference. He'd been presenting to 500 people when supposedly authorizing this transfer. The account details included a routing number James instantly recognized. A chill ran down his spine. "Victoria," he whispered. His own sister was definitely involved. A knock at the door made him freeze. Quickly hiding the notebook, James approached the door cautiously. "Who is it?" "Delivery for James Hayes." James peered through the peephole. A young delivery person held a small package. Cautiously opening the door, James accepted the package. No return address, just his alias printed on a label. Inside was a burner phone and a note. "I know who you are. Meet tomorrow night at the old barn. Come alone. 11 p.m. James stared at the message, heart racing. Someone had discovered his identity. But who? Sarah? Michael? Victoria? The phone buzzed with an incoming text. The name appearing repeatedly in these records is unthinkable. But before you process this information, be aware that someone knows exactly what you're looking for. Sleep eluded James that night. The burner phone sat on his nightstand like a ticking bomb. Someone knew his identity. But was it friend or foe? Dawn found him red-eyed but resolved. At the farm, he deliberately maintained his routine, watching for anyone paying special attention to him. Rodriguez assigned him to equipment maintenance, cleaning tractors in the large barn where seasonal machinery was stored. "Keep your head down today," Ernesto whispered as they passed. "Suits are everywhere." James nodded gratefully. The older worker had become an unwitting ally. Inside the maintenance barn, James spotted Michael through the windows, touring the facility with two men in expensive suits. They examined equipment, making notes on tablets. Asset evaluation. They were cataloging everything of value. "Vultures," muttered Bobby, the maintenance supervisor. "Picking the bones before the animal's even dead." "You worked here long?" James asked casually. 15 years, Bobby replied. "Since Harrison first modernized this place." He spat on the ground. Man was a ruthless businessman, but at least he built something. These new folks just tear down. James swallowed his discomfort at hearing himself described. "Heard the accountants been asking questions?" he ventured. Bobby snorted. "Sarah? Yeah, she's either brave or stupid. Started digging into the books her first week. Peterson tried to shut her down, but she threatened to go to the SEC or something." This confirmed James's suspicion. Sarah wasn't part of the conspiracy. She'd discovered irregularities and was investigating independently. Midday, James maneuvered to the cafeteria when Sarah typically ate lunch. She entered precisely at 12:30, looked directly at his table, then deliberately sat elsewhere. Message: "Received, don't approach me." Instead, James found himself seated with Luis and two other veteran workers. "Notice how Peterson jumps whenever Randall calls?" Luis remarked. "Used to be Harrison's man, now he's everybody's dog." "Randall's the suit who visits often?" James asked. "Harrison's cousin," nodded Luis. "Always smiling, that one, even when he's firing people. Told us we'd all keep our jobs after the takeover," added another worker bitterly. 2 weeks later, half the staff gone. And the woman who comes with him sometimes? James pressed. The workers exchanged glances. Harrison's ex-wife, Louise finally answered. Eleanor something now. Remarried rich. James nearly choked on his water. Eleanor? His ex-wife who'd settled for a modest divorce package instead of fighting for half his fortune? It made terrifying sense. She knew his habits, his security, his business intimately. Returning to work, James's mind spun with connections. Michael, Victoria, Eleanor, people he'd trusted implicitly, family members, all potentially conspiring against him. But why dismantle the farm's technology? What was the end game? Late afternoon brought a new development. Sarah walked deliberately past James, dropping a folded note that landed near his boot. He waited until no one was looking before retrieving it. 2 words. Trust no one. That evening, James drove to a diner 20 miles away, ensuring he wasn't followed. Using the motel's poor Wi-Fi to research might draw attention. At the diner, he connected his phone to their network and searched for information on Vertex Capital Partners. The firm specialized in agricultural land acquisition. Recent news showed they'd purchased 12 former Harrison Agricultural Industries properties after the bankruptcy. Their CEO was listed as Richard Conway, Eleanor's new husband. The pieces were fitting together. Eleanor had married Conway, possibly orchestrating James's downfall from the beginning. Victoria and Michael, feeling overlooked in the company hierarchy, had helped execute the plan from within. Together, they'd systematically drained his fortune and acquired his assets at bankruptcy prices. But why go through such elaborate measures? Why not just compete legitimately? Another discovery made James's blood run cold. Vertex had applied for permits to convert all acquired agricultural land to commercial and residential development. They weren't interested in farming. They wanted the land for real estate development worth billions. The realization hit James like a physical blow. His life's work, building sustainable, innovative agricultural systems, was being dismantled to make way for shopping malls and condominiums. Returning to his motel, James found a small package outside his door. Inside was a USB drive. He plugged it into his phone, discovering hundreds of financial documents, evidence of the elaborate scheme, far more comprehensive than what he'd found so far. At 10:45 p.m., James drove toward the farm, parking half a mile away and approaching the old barn, on foot. The arranged meeting might be a trap, but he needed answers. Inside the darkened barn, James waited, senses alert. At exactly 11 p.m., the door opened. "I wasn't sure you'd come," Sarah said, stepping inside. "Especially after my warning. You know who I am," James stated. "James Harrison." She nodded. "Recognized you the third day, despite the disguise. I've studied your company financials for months. You're not part of this? I was hired to find accounting irregularities. Instead, I found a conspiracy." She gestured to the USB. "Made copies before they could delete everything. Why help me?" "Because what they're doing isn't just illegal. It's destroying something important." Sarah stepped closer. "We don't have much time. They suspect I've found something." "Who's they?" "Your cousin Michael, your sister Victoria, your ex-wife Eleanor, and her new husband. They've been planning this for years." When Sarah invited James to dinner, James whispered to himself, recalling his narrative. He knew he should refuse. She was clearly involved in the scheme, but she was also the only one who could lead him to the documents that would prove who was behind everything. "So they've been planning this for years?" James asked, his voice barely audible in the darkened barn. Sarah nodded, her face partially illuminated by the small flashlight she carried. "Eleanor started positioning herself at least 3 years before your divorce. She met Conway at an agricultural investment conference you were too busy to attend." The irony wasn't lost on James. His workaholic tendencies had created the opening for his own destruction. And Victoria? Recruited shortly after. She felt, Sarah hesitated. "Betrayed," James finished. "Because I took control of the company after our parents died. She was brilliant, James. Your CFO Michael told me she had better financial instincts than you ever did." James winced. He'd always seen Victoria as his little sister, not a business equal. Another blind spot. "The plan was elegant," Sarah continued. "They didn't steal directly from the company. That would have triggered audits. Instead, they created a sophisticated network of declining investments, failed expansions, and phantom projects that slowly bled your empire dry. And I never saw it," James admitted bitterly. "You weren't meant to. Every failure was plausibly explained." Every loss seemed legitimate. By the time you noticed something wrong, it was too late, James finished. But why help me? You work for them. Sarah's expression hardened. I was hired to find accounting irregularities by Conway. He presented, himself as a responsible investor cleaning up after acquiring distressed assets. I believed him until I found documents connecting him to the very irregularities I was investigating. Then why haven't you gone to the authorities? With what? Everything I've found is circumstantial. They've covered their tracks brilliantly. She leaned forward. But you, the great James Harrison working as a farm laborer to uncover the truth, that's something they never anticipated. A noise outside made them both freeze. Sarah quickly extinguished her flashlight. Footsteps approached, then passed. We can't stay here, she whispered. Tomorrow night, my place. I'll text the address to the burner phone. Before James could respond, she slipped out the rear door into the darkness. The next day moved with excruciating slowness. James performed his labor mechanically, mind racing with revelations. His sister, his cousin, his ex-wife, all conspiring against him for years. During lunch, he noticed Michael's black SUV parked outside the administrative building. Through the cafeteria window, James could see him engaged in intense conversation with Peterson. The farm manager looked ashen, nodding repeatedly. Poor Peterson, Louise commented, following James's gaze. Man's aged 10 years these past months. What's Randall doing here so often? James asked. Louise shrugged. Supervising the dismantling, I guess. Equipment leaves every night. They think we don't notice. After work, James drove to the address Sarah had texted. Her modest apartment was in a small town 20 miles from the farm. She opened the door immediately, ushering him inside. I ordered food, she said, gesturing to take out containers on the coffee table. Figured you'd be hungry after today. James was touched by the consideration. When was the last time someone had thought about his basic needs? Sarah spread documents across the table as they ate. Everything gets funneled through shell companies to Vertex Capital, then distributed to the conspirators through offshore accounts. James examined a particular document, frowning. This signature, it's mine, but I never signed this. They forged your electronic signature, Sarah explained. Michael had access to your authentication codes, but this doesn't explain why they're dismantling the farm technology, James noted. Sarah hesitated. That's where it gets complicated. The technology you developed, sustainable agriculture systems, automated crop management, it works too well. Too well? Conway's real business is land development. Agricultural land rezoned for commercial development brings 100 times the profit. But your systems proved that sustainable farming could be just as profitable as development. James understood, suddenly. They're not just stealing my company. They're destroying my legacy, proving my innovations were failures. Exactly, Sarah confirmed. If your systems are dismantled and the land subsequently fails as farmland, rezoning approval becomes much easier. She handed him a confidential folder. This is their complete plan. 12 former Harrison properties, all slated for commercial development. Projected profit, $8.7 billion. James stared at the documents, a strange emotion washing over him. Not just anger at the betrayal, but profound sadness. His life's work in agricultural innovation, meant to feed people sustainably, was being systematically erased. The confidential folder revealed not only who had orchestrated his ruin, he whispered, but also why. The truth was more painful than any financial betrayal. His empire had been built on a lie that now came back to haunt him. Sarah looked at him curiously. What lie? James met her gaze. The lie that I could build something meaningful without caring about people. I treated Victoria as a subordinate, not a partner. I ignored Eleanor's contributions. I saw employees as assets, not humans. That doesn't justify what they did, Sarah argued. No, James agreed, but it explains how I missed the warning signs. I never connected with the people closest to me. His hand brushed against Sarah's as they reached for the same document. Their eyes met briefly. What's your plan now? She asked softly. James faced his most critical decision. Expose everyone and everything, destroying his family and the remains of his company, or find another way forward that preserved what mattered most. Dawn broke with James still at Sarah's apartment, surrounded by evidence of the conspiracy. They'd worked through the night, connecting financial trails across dozens of shell companies. We have enough to bring to the FBI, Sarah said, stretching her tired muscles. James shook his head. Not yet. These people are too connected. We need something irrefutable, something they can't deny or escape. Sarah studied him. You have a plan. The beginning of one, James admitted. Conway, Eleanor, Victoria, and Michael are all scheduled to visit the farm tomorrow for a progress meeting. It's our opportunity to catch them all together. And do what exactly? Sarah asked. You're still just a farmhand to everyone else. For now, James said. I need access to Peterson's office. He keeps backup records of all Harrison Agricultural Industries' digital authorizations. That's suicide, Sarah protested. Security cameras everywhere. Not if the power mysteriously goes out. James smiled grimly. Bobby in maintenance mentioned the electrical system is temperamental during thunderstorms. There's no storm forecast for tomorrow. There. Will be, James assured her. At least a power failure that resembles one. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text. Her face paled as she read it. Michael wants a complete audit report by tomorrow morning. He knows something's wrong. Can you stall him? I can say I need more. Time to compile everything. But he'll be suspicious. She hesitated. James, they're dangerous people. Conway especially. He didn't get where he is by being gentle with obstacles. James took her hand. I've faced corporate sharks my entire career. I can handle this. This isn't corporate politics anymore, Sarah warned. This is $8 billion of criminal conspiracy. Then it's a good thing I'm not alone. James squeezed her hand gently. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the weight of their shared danger created an unexpected intimacy. Sarah looked away first. I should get to work on that report, she said, standing abruptly. I'll stall as much as I can. That evening, James met secretly with Bobby from maintenance. A few $100s ensured the farm's backup generator would mysteriously fail during tomorrow's executive meeting. Back at his motel, James found his door slightly ajar. Heart racing, he entered cautiously. The room had been searched thoroughly but professionally. Nothing was missing, but someone had been looking for something specific. His phone rang, the burner phone from Sarah. They're on to us, she said without preamble. Michael asked me directly today if I'd noticed any unusual workers asking questions. What did you say? That I barely interact with field workers. But James, he didn't believe me. I can tell. Stick to the plan, James insisted. Tomorrow at exactly 10 a.m. during their meeting. After hanging up, James paced the small room. The confrontation he'd been preparing for was coming faster than anticipated. He needed to contact David, his attorney friend, the only person outside this situation he still trusted. Using the burner phone, James called David's private number. It's me, James said when David answered. A pause. Jesus Christ, James? Where have you been? The FBI's looking for you, claiming offshore account irregularities. Of course they are, James replied bitterly. Victoria and Michael framed me while stealing everything. James quickly explained the situation, ending with tomorrow's plan. This is insane, David argued. Let me bring in federal prosecutors. I have contacts. Not yet, James insisted. I need them all together, caught red-handed. Can you be ready with legal paperwork? Injunctions against asset liquidation, emergency petitions for evidence preservation. David sighed. I'll have everything prepared. But James, be careful. These people destroyed your life once already. With the evidence in hand and the plan laid out, James whispered to himself after hanging up. I was ready for the final confrontation, but when my phone rang that night, the voice on the other end froze my blood. The burner phone rang again. An unknown number. Hello, James, said a familiar female voice when he answered. Or should I call you James Hayes now? Victoria, his sister. How long have you known? James asked, keeping his voice steady. Since day 3, Victoria replied smoothly. Your disguise is good, but I grew up with you, remember? I know how you move, how you think. Then why let me continue? Curiosity, she answered. I wanted to see how far you'd go. Playing farmhand, digging through records, befriending the naive accountant. It's been quite entertaining. Was destroying me entertaining too? James asked, anger finally seeping into his voice. Victoria laughed softly. Oh, James, always the victim, never the villain. You never once asked yourself why this happened, did you? Enlighten me. Not over the phone, Victoria replied. Meet me tomorrow. The old barn, 9 a.m. Come alone. The line went dead. James stared at the phone, mind racing. The meeting was a trap. It had to be. But it was also his only chance to confront Victoria directly, to understand why his own sister had betrayed him. His original plan for the 10 a.m. confrontation would need adjustment. Victoria had forced his hand. That night, James sent one final text to Sarah. Plans changed. Victoria knows. Meeting her 9 a.m. at the barn. If I don't contact you by 9:30, proceed without me. Sarah's response came quickly. It's a trap. Don't go alone. But James knew he had no choice. This had started with family, and with family it would end. The old barn loomed against the dawn sky as James approached. Inside these weathered walls, he would finally confront his sister. The first family confrontation in what promised to be a day of reckoning. James entered cautiously, senses alert for any trap. The barn was empty except for Victoria, who stood beside an old workbench, elegant as always in a tailored pantsuit that cost more than a farmhand's monthly salary. "Hello, brother," she said coolly. "The disguise is impressive, but your posture still screams CEO." "Why, Victoria?" James asked simply. Her smile faded. 20 years, James. 20 years watching you take all the credit while I worked in your shadow. You could have told me how you felt. Victoria laughed bitterly. I did. Countless times. Victoria, brilliant proposal, but we'll modify it this way. Victoria, excellent insight, but we need to prioritize differently. Always dismissed. Always secondary. So you destroyed everything I built? Our parents' legacy? Our parents left. The company to both of us, Victoria countered. You took control because you were older, male, more confident. I created financial models that made billions while you played visionary in the press. James felt the truth in her words like physical blows. And Michael, Eleanor? Michael resented being treated as a glorified accountant despite his MBA from Wharton. Eleanor, well, she simply saw opportunity after you neglected her for years. And Conway? A means to an end, Victoria replied dismissively. He provided capital and connections. James stepped closer. The farm technology. Why dismantle it? Because it works, Victoria admitted. Your sustainable agriculture innovations actually work, which threatens Conway's development plans. That part was never my idea. Then help me stop them, James urged. Victoria's expression hardened. Too late. The others are arriving soon. Conway believes I'm here to eliminate evidence. She glanced at her watch. You should leave. Now. I'm not running. Then you're a fool. Victoria moved toward the door. Conway isn't like us, James. He doesn't care about legacy or family. He cares about profit. Outside, vehicles approached. Multiple engines growing louder. I've reprogrammed the electrical shutdown for 9:30, James said quickly. Sarah has copies of all documentation. David is standing by with legal paperwork. Victoria paused, surprise crossing her features. You've been busy. I learned from the best, James replied, a hint of respect in his voice. The barn door opened. Michael entered first, followed by Eleanor and a tall, distinguished man James recognized as Richard Conway. Victoria, what's... Michael began, then froze upon seeing James. What the hell? Family reunion, Victoria said dryly. My brother seems remarkably hard to destroy. Conway studied James with cold calculation. Mr. Harrison, impressive resourcefulness. James, Eleanor stepped forward, genuinely shocked. You're the farmhand everyone's been talking about? Surprise. James replied without humor. Conway's hand moved toward his jacket pocket. This complicates matters unnecessarily. I wouldn't, Victoria warned, surprising everyone. James has evidence. Copies distributed to multiple sources. Conway's eyes narrowed. Including your involvement? I never denied my role, Victoria responded calmly. The tension in the barn was electric. James felt rather than heard the approaching footsteps outside. Too many for just Sarah. The confrontation was expanding beyond his control. At 9:30 precisely, the lights flickered and died. Emergency sirens wailed from the main complex. What's happening? Eleanor demanded. The barn door burst open. Peterson entered, followed by Sarah and, to James's surprise, Ernesto and several other workers. It's over, Peterson announced. FBI just arrived at the main building. Someone sent them complete documentation of the entire scheme. All eyes turned to Sarah, who held up her phone defiantly. When I saw all of you heading to the barn, I called them, she explained. The electrical failure was just good timing. Conway moved with unexpected speed, grabbing Victoria and pressing something against her side. Nobody moves, or she dies first. Richard, Eleanor gasped. Shut up, Conway hissed. This entire operation is still salvageable. We just need to eliminate loose ends. James stepped forward. It's over, Conway. The farm workers you've been treating like disposable machinery, they've witnessed everything. Conway glanced around, noticing for the first time that several workers had gathered. At the doorway, phones recording. When James finally removed his disguise in front of everyone at the farm, James said clearly, for the benefit of the recordings. The silence was deafening. With deliberate movements, James pulled off his cap, wiped the work dirt from his face, and straightened to his full height, transforming from James Hayes, farmhand, to James Harrison, CEO. The faces staring at him showed not only surprise, he continued, but something he feared much more, disappointment. He had recovered his fortune, but had he lost something much more valuable in the process? The workers' expressions confirmed his words, shock, but also betrayal. To them, he had been one of them, had shared their burdens. Now he stood revealed as the very embodiment of the wealth that had always controlled their lives. Sirens approached. Conway released Victoria, desperation, replacing calculation in his eyes. For the first time, James saw fear in his co-conspirators' faces, not fear of legal consequences, but fear of confronting what they had become. 1 year later, a black pickup truck, new but deliberately modest, pulled up to the renamed Harrison Victoria Agricultural Center. James stepped out, no longer disguised, but forever changed by his time as a farmhand. The legal aftermath had been swift and merciless. Conway faced multiple federal charges for fraud and racketeering. Eleanor had turned states, evidence against her husband in exchange for leniency. Michael was serving house arrest while cooperating with authorities. Victoria's case had been more complex. Despite her involvement, her testimony proved crucial in recovering much of the stolen assets. The judge, noting her remorse and cooperation, had sentenced her to community service and financial restitution. James walked toward the main building, where workers were gathering for the morning meeting. Unlike the old days, he didn't arrive by helicopter. He arrived early, knowing each worker by name. "Morning, boss," Ernesto called, approaching with the clipboard. "Irrigation system in the East Field is fully operational again." "The automated version?" James asked. "Yes, but with the modifications your sister suggested. Uses 30% less water." James nodded appreciatively. Victoria's financial brilliance, finally acknowledged, was now applied to improving rather than undermining the business. Her office was adjacent to his, equal partners at last. Inside, Sarah waited in the conference room with Peterson and several department heads. Their relationship had evolved cautiously from professional to personal over the months, built on mutual respect rather than the power dynamics that had poisoned his previous relationships. "Everyone's ready," Sarah said, smiling. "They're excited about the announcement." James took a deep breath before entering the large meeting hall where all farm employees had gathered. The faces looking back at him were no longer strangers. He'd worked alongside many of them, felt their pain, shared their struggles. "1 year ago," James began, "I stood in this room as someone else, both literally and figuratively. I had lost everything, but learned something invaluable in return." He gestured to the screens behind him, which displayed the new company structure. Today, Harrison Agricultural Industries is reborn as a cooperative, 25% ownership, distributed among all employees. Profit sharing, educational benefits, healthcare, murmurs rippled through the crowd. "This isn't charity," James continued. "It's recognition that a company's greatest assets are its people. I forgot that once. I won't again." James introduced the new executive team, a mix of experienced managers and promoted farm workers. Luis, the veteran worker who had unknowingly provided crucial information during James's investigation, was now operations manager. After the meeting, James walked the fields alone, remembering his first days of physical labor, the blisters on his hands, the exhaustion in his muscles. The experience had humbled him in ways no business setback ever could. Sarah found him there, staring at the horizon. "Board approved the expansion," she said. 3 more sustainable farms by next year. And the Agricultural Education Center? Breaking ground next month. Victoria's already interviewing staff. James nodded satisfactorily. The center would train the next generation of farmers in sustainable practices, preserving agricultural land instead of converting it to strip malls. "Still having dinner with your sister tonight?" Sarah asked. "Yes. Monthly tradition now." James smiled wryly. Still awkward, but getting better. Their relationship was healing gradually. Victoria had admitted that her resentment had consumed her, blinding her to the consequences of her actions. James had acknowledged how his dismissive treatment had fueled that resentment. "This came for you," Sarah said, handing him an envelope. No return address. Inside was a newspaper clipping about Conway's upcoming trial and a handwritten note. "Some secrets remain buried, waiting to be discovered." James frowned. "Eleanor? The handwriting doesn't match what we have on file," Sarah replied. The note was a reminder. Despite their success rebuilding, darker elements remained. Conway had connections they hadn't yet uncovered, co-conspirators still hidden. "Maybe the story of the disguised millionaire hasn't yet come to an end," James murmured. That evening, as workers ended their shifts, James noticed the difference from a year ago. They walked taller, spoke more freely, owned their work in ways impossible under the old regime. Ernesto approached as James prepared to leave. "My son got the scholarship," he said proudly. "First in our family to attend college." "Agricultural sciences?" James asked. "Engineering?" Ernesto grinned. "Says he's going to design better farm equipment that doesn't break a man's back." James felt something he rarely experienced in his previous life: simple, uncomplicated happiness at another's good fortune. A year later, when the new farm headquarters was inaugurated, James reflected silently. The former workers couldn't believe the transformation. As he celebrated with his new family found in the fields, James understood that his greatest loss had led to his most valuable gain: perspective. The billionaire who had never noticed his workers now saw them as individuals. The executive who had missed his sister's brilliance now recognized it daily. The disguised millionaire had found something worth far more than his fortune. He had found humanity, both in others and in himself. As our story comes to an end, we've witnessed James Harrison's remarkable journey from wealth to poverty and back again. But the true wealth he found wasn't in his recovered fortune. It was in the connections he made, the lessons he learned, and the new purpose he discovered. Sometimes, life strips everything away so we can see what truly matters. James had to lose his empire to gain his humanity. He had to experience betrayal to understand the value of genuine loyalty. What would you do if everything you built was suddenly taken from you? Would you have the courage to start over, to work with your hands, to face those who betrayed you? If you enjoyed this story of redemption and justice, you'll be captivated by our next video. Get out, ex-convict. The son shouted at his mother. The bride's father reveals the truth. It's another powerful tale of family secrets, shocking revelations, and the moment when truth finally comes to light. Don't forget to like and subscribe to check out tomorrow's story on our channel. And remember, sometimes the greatest fortunes are not measured in dollars, but in the truth we discover about ourselves and the people around us. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.